Welcome. We're glad you found us. You're listening to Rewilded, a podcast for the social imagination. On this episode,
We've convened as a team because all is not well at the Gulf Coast CRX in New Orleans in the year 2040. The problem? A mysterious source of money that threatens to upend a coalition that could change the lives of many people.
About a week ago, Ignited Word came out with the first installment of this flash fiction series. Can you tell us more about the Reviewer of Pious Money?
Sure. Well, the story itself, it's a short piece and it's the first of three in the stories. This is the first installment. It is about something that we don't typically see very often in nonprofit and philanthropy work, which is money without a known source. We may have all kinds of issues with money and procurement of money, but not knowing the source is typically not one of them, except in the rare case of like an anonymous donor. But anyway, so the protagonist is Nia. It's set in the year 2040 in New Orleans. She works at this civic resource exchange, which is a community financing mechanism with a mix of public and private money. It's a blended finance institution of which there are thousands like it across the country, and they form this network. Anyway, so she finds this tranche of money that has an unknown source, and she's just randomly going through the software and reviewing different allocations, and she finds this unknown source code. And when she looks closer at it, she finds out that the money is supposed to be going to a housing and wellness cooperative in a neighborhood where she and her colleagues have been working really hard to earn the trust of the neighborhood coalition that has been championing this project. And so, whereas normally she might kind of flag this suspicious source for a compliance review, she has a bit of pause because she knows that that would then set back the funding for the project by at least 6 months as compliance procedures are run. And that's going to like completely upend whatever fragile trust she had been working so hard to establish with this community and the neighborhood coalition. And so that's sort of the predicament she's in. And the story kind of puts us in a meeting, which is typically quite a boring setting for stories, but our stories opens in a meeting as she's debating what to do.
the yarn was lace weight and smoothly compliant, and Nia Okafor was 3 rows into a feather and fan pattern when she decided, for the fourth time that morning, not to say anything. It wasn't that she didn't know what she'd seen. She'd been in the disbursement reconciliation module at 11:30 on a Thursday, her hands too stiff from her rheumatoid arthritis to knit properly, her brain exasperatingly acrobatic, when she found it. A $314,000 draw matched against a fund code that didn't exist in any registry she could locate. 6 characters. VRCX-7.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of one of the interesting parts of that is, the tedium of what essentially is like an everyday thing, a meeting, but there's tension there that you can feel. And I really like how it was written. It was very descriptive and you can really imagine yourself in that. What was the inspiration behind it?
Well, the direct inspiration was our map of possibility philanthropy. And for our listeners that are wondering what the heck I'm talking about, we have a fictitious geographic map sitting on one of our web pages, which has entries of actual inspiring things happening in the world of philanthropy, as well as speculative ones in a specific region of the map. And so there was a specific entry, which I'll let you speak to, Robbie, which I guess produced the germ of the story in terms of thinking about community-led finance as one aspect of the future of philanthropy. But there are other inspirations as far as just the storytelling component. So it's no secret that I'm also a writer of fiction, and I've had these sort of like blending of the literary into the social impact world aspirations for a very long time. But writing fiction is extremely slow and in many ways tedious and very labor and skill intensive. It would not have been possible if not for the advent of AI and being able to use AI as a writing partner to take on some aspects of the writing process. So I guess that opened this process-based inspiration of, oh yeah, this could make it possible, and let's give it a shot and tie it to a project we're currently working on.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, going back to your reference to the map of possibility entry. Yeah, that was an idea that I had. It's not as detailed as the world that you were able to paint, but the idea behind that story of like a community managed pool of resources, part of that was inspired by this pre-colonial society here in the Philippines called barangay. These are self-governing villages that are made up of like 50 to 100 families. It's influenced Filipino culture, and that's really rooted in that we're taking care of our own sort of mentality. And another aspect of what inspired me, I was working with a startup that was trying to shift this middleman dominated agricultural system where produce is being sold by middlemen instead of farmers going directly to the market. And what I've seen there was that any sort of aid coming from the national government or any external aid groups was the trickle down was very slow, and it wasn't reaching areas of rural communities that really needed the help. Like roads weren't fixed for years. It was very hard for farmers to bring their produce to the main market in the city, and they didn't have any equipment. So what happened was a lot of these communities formed their own cooperatives, and this is a government sponsored approach to it, but it's helped them address some of those issues directly without having to wait for government approvals, allowing them to have this pool of funds that they can loan to members of the cooperatives. And yeah, that's essentially what inspired that story for me, is just that community rooted aspect of mutual aid here in the Philippines. How about you, Anna or Dernisha? What are your thoughts about the story and kind of the context behind it?
Yeah, for me, okay, this is not related to like philanthropy in general, but I do love a good neurodivergent representation in in literature I consume. Yeah, as a crafts girly, I very much feel for Nia doing crafts well in the meeting. But other than that, more to the funding aspect of it. I think it's really interesting for me because I have been part of organizations where we're more the fundees rather than the funder. And it's interesting for me to see like this perspective of gaining community trust as part of grant making as well. For me, it always felt like the other way around. As fundees, we're trying to appease funders. And it's interesting, this dilemma, which I guess we'll get onto later. But reading through it, I was thinking, did I miss something? Like, it felt like that general animosity in the story about not knowing where the funding, where that code was coming from, that general unknown element of it, it helped me think of like how transparency is important also on like the funders side.
And I was really excited when I heard you talk about the animosity piece, because in my previous work, I've worked at a foundation, and it's an interesting space to be in. Because of course, I think funders hold a certain amount of power, like they're deciding where funding is going. But even amongst those within an organization, there's all these different power dynamics at play of like who decides where the funding goes where. If something, as Nia noticed, isn't right with the funding, does she even have the power to speak up? And if she does, what are the implications for that for a community that might be expecting that? So I was really intrigued by the story of just the different levels of power that were happening throughout the story. And I hope we can dig into that a bit, and also the ethics of it, which is crucial, I think, for funders to keep at top of mind when they're just dealing with all these different communities, businesses, etc., and controlling the strings of money. So
That's very interesting. Like from an outsider's perspective, that's not really something that people expect of philanthropic organizations that there's like internal issues at play and power dynamics, as you mentioned. About you, Malika, your thoughts?
Ooh, I've been really enjoying this aspect of the conversation in particular because it's where I get to have some more feedback into what aspects are sticking out to various people and why. I enjoyed writing it in many ways, and I think one thing that I could maybe give brief comments on, but I'm really curious to hear others' thoughts about is the speculative aspect of it. Obviously, there's real people. There's Mia, and I love that you called out that she's neurodivergent. She's got ADHD, and she has to like knit to calm her thoughts. And the civic resource exchanges are these sort of the descendants in future times of the current community development finance institutions in the US. I'm not by no means an expert on them and not to get into the weeds of what they're like, but this was positing a world where there's a much more robust and extensive network of blended finance flowing into underserved communities throughout the country, and that there is a much more routine engagement of rank and file citizens in impact investment into the process, and of course a blend of federal funding, state funding. So it's a pretty complex system, but as a result, a lot more money, like loads and loads more money, is pouring into community development finance. And what we find in the stories, of course, it doesn't mean it's the end and everybody lives happily ever after. There's still lots of problems, but in some ways, it's meant to be a huge improvement over the current system today. And I guess I would say that I'm very keen to hear people's thoughts, especially people that work in the impact investing or like community finance space, to kind of see what they think about the speculative aspects of this very, as you mentioned, Robbie, like it's a little bit of a tedious explanation of this funding mechanism, but it's a crucial part of the story, like the what if community development finance looks like this in the future. And you gave an interesting explanation of the roots in the Philippines that sort of inspired the community-led aspects of it.
Yeah. Do you think for people who are very immersed in this sort of context, do you think they'd find some catharsis to this? Just like identifying those little things that people struggle with, professionals who struggle with these kinds of experiences on a day-to-day basis?
I I think so. I don't want to answer for Malika, but I think so. I currently work in the economic development space, and I think so. I think these tensions are, as Anna put it, the animosity that comes up in the workplace is definitely something that I think folks would be interested in exploring. And to your words, Robbie, would just be good for them to like resonate on, because it
Right.
probably reflects a lot of the dynamics they're dealing with their
Yeah.
own workspace.
But I was just going to say there's everyday workplace drama in the story that we can all relate to, no matter what
Mhm.
your industry field you work in. So yeah, I hope folks can resonate with that. But
And maybe, for those who are listening, if you want to vent out some of your frustrations productively, you can write fiction.
Now, I was just gonna say, I don't know if the listeners will be able to see the comic that is attached to the article, but Nia is a woman of color. And there's one other woman of color at the table. So I think that also like racial and everyone else is, a white person in the character, I'm forgetting his name, the other character in the story is a white male. So
Jason, yeah.
Jason, yeah. So there's those dynamics at play too. So you're looking at power, you're looking at, the racial dynamics, especially in the US, in New Orleans, that could be coming up and be, at play while she's grappling whether or not she wants to say something about this unknown funding that has appeared.
So yeah, for those who are interested in knowing more, we'll add a link in the description to the piece, so you can read not just the flash fiction, but the accompanying visuals that was developed by another team member who's not here, Jay. We're also eager to see what everyone else thinks about the flash fiction.
Nia tried to remind herself that somehow these tedious meetings were the container for what she still loved. The brief, fragile moment when a room could decide that a place mattered, that a block deserved cooling infrastructure, that a tenant union deserved legal defense capital, that a woman with a bakery and a terrible balance sheet still deserved a chance. The $314,000 that had jolted her already awake brain that Thursday night was allocated to the Abundance Commons, a cooperative housing and wellness development in Chantilly. It had taken Nia the better part of 2 years to help shepherd Abundance Commons toward funding. It should have been easier, because it was exactly the kind of project the Gulf Coast CRX existed to fund. A place where low-income seniors, brash social entrepreneurs, and nervous young guild apprentices might rub shoulders.
So going deeper into discussing the kind of themes in the story, I'll ask this question first. Power often manifests as the ability to decide how money is spent. How does that theme manifest in the story? Does it reflect a greater capacity to share power, or is it more of a repeat of familiar patterns?
I can hop in. So I think it does a bit of both. So I think, Jason and Nia working at a CDFI, deciding where money is going to be spent, kind of reflects like that general theme of power. I think Nia's reflections on thinking about where the money goes, maybe the ones who most need it, feels like her growing in the space, the capacity to share that power more, but still it's like the same system, of like that top down approach and money going to smaller businesses or smaller organizations. So it seems like that's a point of tension in the story. Like she's, thinking about like how can power be shared more broadly, but she's also working within a traditional system of how funds are spent.
Yeah, based on my understanding of the story and how I saw it, yeah, there is that aspect of, this is supposed to be kind of a more robust reiteration of CDFI, but there are still kind of phantoms of the old system manifesting itself, and those are the kinds of things that we want to avoid, but because of the complicated process of approving these things, because we do have to at least follow a procedure to prioritize things, right? And this kind of shows that even a new system that we want to propose is still imperfect.
I think just jumping off of like what you, Robbie, and Darnisha have already mentioned, it's also interesting how Nia, in a sense, wants to share power, but she's also a gatekeeper, I would say,
Yeah.
in the sense that like she has a say on who gets the money and how the money gets dispersed. And it's interesting from this perspective because I feel that I guess that was the point of the story, but like there's this dilemma with transparency, which is a responsibility that comes with power.
Yeah, and you'll see some mentions, like for example, there's a community committee at the CRX, Civic Resource Exchange, that it's only a brief mention, but the implication is that the community has a say, a vote in deciding how funds are spent. But then in that initial meeting, which forms the setting for the story, you don't really get a strong sense of community voice at the table. It does seem a bit corporate. And we talked a little earlier in the call about how Nia does kind of feel accountable and a bit apprehensive about the potential loss of trust with the neighborhood coalition head that she's been working with. So there certainly is that manifest, okay, the community does have a seat at the table or have some sway, but to what extent does that play out? I guess we'll just have to see what happens in subsequent installments.
But yeah, it's interesting, and very much looking forward to seeing what the next chapter holds for Nia and the CRX. So in the story, Nia is torn between two right choices, each of which has its ethical justification. What similar tensions are present in today's community development financing or just philanthropy in general? Is there anything specific to like personal experience you've encountered?
And yeah, without spoiling, we're talking about Mia wanting to say something to her colleague versus letting it slide. Is that the two right choices you're referring to, Robbie?
Yeah, pretty much like
Yeah.
doing something about it or kind of just
Yeah. I definitely think that this is a tension. I think that previously working at a foundation has came up, in my own work. Will you stick to a certain, moral or ethic code, even when you know it could be detrimental to a community that you're serving? And I think that's what Nia is grappling with. I think, there's a lot of conversations about ethics in the workplace and in financing and philanthropy. But I think the thing that isn't talked about a lot is like it's hard to uphold ethics when you're in a very challenging situation and you know that doing the morally right thing, might have some negative outcomes for the folks that you just want to see succeed at their work. So I think Nia's like really grappling with, am I willing to bend the rules if it's going to lead to a successful outcome for a community, or does me bending the rules then lead to more unethical uncertainties at the workplace? It could start to become a pattern. And I think this pops up all the time. And I think that, just there's not a lot of conversation around that in the philanthropic and financing space.
Darnisha, without revealing too much, are there any examples you're able to share that help us understand what that might look like when it comes to disbursing money?
Yeah, without revealing too much. So I think I've seen this come up with not necessarily like seeing a discrepancy in funds. I don't have that insight into it, but definitely when assessing applications of organizations, and maybe I think it doesn't get talked about a lot. It really counts like who you know in a space, and that comes up when applications are being decided. Um, and there's always going to be a decision maker in the room, even if the other folks in the room might not necessarily agree with where a funding application is going. If that decision maker weighs in heavily and they want it to go to a certain space, even though that, you have a set of criteria, this applicant might not tick all those boxes. Do you stand up and say something as the other person in the room? I don't know. It's, there's a lot of power at play in philanthropic and financing spaces.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's likewise a very difficult choice of whether to say something or not, because if a decision maker weighs in disproportionately, but yet there are probably no bad choices. It's not like they're choosing to give it to a completely unworthy recipient or grantee. It's that the process hasn't been upheld, right? So I can see how there's a lot of there are gray areas, which might just complicate that decision to speak up or not.
It definitely does. And I think definitely like job security definitely comes into play too, like thinking about, I don't know Nia's background or like how long it might have taken her to get this job or what else she has going on in her life. But, speaking out could possibly put her into a detrimental situation. So there's just all these different things at play that don't get talked about a lot that I think that this story surfaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I mean, I don't have experience on like funding side, but it does feel like with philanthropic work or really in the social sector, there's this a constant tension between like the urgency of the need and how depth you want the process to be. And I feel like that's in the same vein as like Nia's problem. That's the same two right things, but you have to know what to prioritize. And I imagine this is like a particularly prevalent tension, especially in like emergency funds, I would say. Things where you need urgent action. Because it always is that battle between the two. And it doesn't always have to be a battle, but it usually is.
Especially like in philanthropy and the social sector, where everyone's pretty much doing well-meaning work, right? But
Yeah.
our own personal biases and things that may influence decisions come into play, which kind of reminds me of like our very own framework for how we do things, the hairballs that we find ourselves in. Has there been a time where maybe in your personal like professional experience that those kinds of like conflicts or like little sort of personal biases have influenced an outcome in your work?
I have an example. I know biases sometimes has a negative connotation, but I think that in this example, it kind of led to a positive outcome. So I was working at a foundation, and we were working with community-based organizations who were receiving funding. And we were deciding what would be like the level of reporting that they would have to do for funding. And I guess a bias on me is like sometimes funders ask for a lot of reporting metrics for very little funding. And the people at the top that I was working with didn't really see that as an issue, but that bias that I held actually opened up like a quote unquote like research project with our grantees of what feels like more realistic reporting metrics for the amount of funding you're receiving. What do you have the capacity to do? And from those findings, we were able to get to like a more realistic reporting system for grantees that wasn't as much as a burden for the communities that were doing that work. So I think that's a time like when a biases kind of led to a different outcome for a funder and a more of a positive outcome for the communities that were getting that funding.
Yeah.
Hope that answers your question,
Yeah,
Robbie.
that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I understand that kind of positive side, which is more of like trust-based, empathetic
Mhm.
sort of way of doing things, which we also have experience with with our client work.
Yeah.
That may be a good kind of, I'm not trying to influence what Malika's gonna write, but like maybe an exploration of that, like, kind of balancing things out.
It'll be taken into consideration.
The CRX was one of many thousands of its kind that dotted every part of the country like spores of a burgeoning fungal network. The old community development financial institutions had been folded, merged, expanded, and finally reborn as civic resource exchanges. Regional, quasi-public financing cooperatives with federal backstops, state matching pools, philanthropic overlays, and municipal data sharing compacts. As a network, the system was imperfect, swollen, political, and much too proud of itself. But in the last decade, as it swelled from mid-billions to low trillions, CRX money had reopened clinics and unshuttered business districts, bought apartment buildings out of speculative chains, rebuilt the flood sewer corridors, and kept more than one neighborhood from being auctioned off after a climate event.
Yeah, now we have reached the part of the show where we take what we've discussed here and use our imagination to explore some of those ideas further into the realm of what's possible. So for today's exercise, we ask everyone this prompt. When we consider the future of community development finance in the US, what do we imagine?
I just want to say here that I understand not everybody's obviously based in the US, but I think that some of the principles explored in the story around community finance and the mechanics of it could apply elsewhere without much difficulty. So we can hopefully be expansive with that prompt. So using the technique that was in the prompt of grafting, which is taking an idea from a completely different field or industry and trying to apply it to this one. Uh, and those combinations will probably look far-fetched, but that's the whole point. What came to mind was yoga, and how in yoga really you move through various poses, which have each of those poses has a different benefit for the body, but the consistent thing throughout is your breath. And there is a flow, it's described as a flow through these poses. And I certainly don't understand public financing very well at all, but I'm more familiar with private philanthropic financing. And when I see debates about how grant making should be done, should be structured, what disbursement requirements and vehicles should look like, sometimes it seems rather like this or that. And if it's this, then it's this into perpetuity. If it's that into perpetuity. Whereas I love the concept from yoga where you kind of cycle through these different poses. And I just wondered what that kind of flexibility might look like in financing, including in the world of blended finance, where for this portion of a funding period, it looks like this, and for this portion, it looks like that, because you can understand that there would be an ebb and flow to grantee or recipient capacities, interests, their ability to comply with requirements, the kind of funding ecosystem that might require different mechanisms for different time periods and phases. Anyway, just the beginning of a concept.
That's really interesting, Malika. You got me thinking a lot. But to answer the question, something that I'm really fascinated about, and what I think about when I think about like reimagining the community development finance system are community investment funds. It's a growing model in the US, and it might be happening in other places as well, where there will be small businesses or community members that will come together and pool funds within a certain community. So they're investors of this community investment fund. And then they have these community meetings where they decide where the funding is going. So they might buy a building to start a local grocery store, or some funding might go to a local childcare facility. How we scale that, I don't know, but I think that is just a beautiful way to build, like, you know, a community, and like to pull together funds and think about collectively, what do we want in our community? Where do we want to invest? It's happening on a small scale now, but if there's just ways that we could scale that, or take, to your point, Malika, using the yoga principles, adapt it in different ways, I think that could be a really powerful way to think about how, the finance structure looks like in the future.
And it has me thinking about what's to come in the story, where I think there's some tie-ins to that. And even if not, it's great fodder for future speculation.
Yeah.
This kind of ties to what Malika and Dernisha were saying, as with regard to like flexibility and more collective giving in the philanthropic sector. My kind of like idea of a better philanthropic sector would be an open source kind of philanthropy where you can you see localized ideas and you can adapt them in your context. And I know that this is something that's happening already, but it would be great if there was like a library of projects and just thinking through what already worked, what needs improvement, and what can be adapted into different contexts. I know Ignited Word is kind of big, like on network mapping, and that's the inspiration behind it, just like building these networks and just like building resources on top of resources.
All right, well, I think that does it for this episode, our very first episode. We would like to thank everyone for listening, and please subscribe to our RSS feed and to all our podcast pages on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. as well as our YouTube channel to stay up to date on when the next episode will come out. Thanks, everyone.